attending the cross-cultural clashes and Hallyu. I apologize, it's been a long day, so my tongue is a little slow. Yes, a long 2 days. I am the moderator, young Ajummah, and this time I will be fairly quiet because we have such wonderful women up here who I know have a lot more to say than I do on the matter. So, first, thank you all for coming. If you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. And yeah, let's get this ball rolling. So we'll start at the end, just make it easier. And then just work our way this way. We can do introductions as to who you are and what you do. And we'll try to sort of stay on time. Yeah, a little bit.
Hello, I'm Heijin Lee. I teach at New York University in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. I study the relationship between plastic surgery, K-beauty, and K-pop, and how that all relates to state power, and genealogies of U.S. imperialism, et cetera, et cetera.
Hello, my name is Patty On. I'm a professor at the University of California, San Diego. I look at K-pop's distribution and circulation in the U.S. and look at how K-pop has been sort of changing the narrative and story about South Korea here. I'm making, have the past of doing some traditional scholarship, but right now I'm making a feature-length documentary about K-pop's relationship to blackness and black music, and sort of placing that within the longer history of black music in South Korea. And so really looking at kind of questions of race and origins of anti-blackness in Korean diaspora.
Hi, my name is Michelle Cho. I teach at the University of Toronto, and I specialize in the globalization of South Korean film and media. And I'm recently very interested in K-pop fan cultures and the way that social media and digital culture more generally has kind of changed the way that people understand identity and culture.
Hi, I'm Miranda Ruth Larsen. I don't have my doctorate yet. Forthcoming. Next few months.
TBD.
Yes.
I mean,
ABD. Yeah, all but dissertation. Yes, it's a great state to be in. So I'm at the University of Tokyo, but I also work as a lecturer at another university in Tokyo. And I study rookie male K-pop idols when they come to Tokyo, specifically how they work dealing with cultural and linguistic gaps coming from Korea to then be in Japan, and how they relate to Japanese fans. So I sort of come at it from both gender studies, fan studies, and a cinema studies background. So that's it for me.
Wonderful. And as I said, yes, please respect them up. On social media, I go by Young Ajummah. Some people might know me as Sarah. I have a lot of things that I do, but for this panel, I really am not going to share it because I don't have my PhD either.
PhD don't mean
But I am very interested in this topic, and so I might interrupt you guys, not to add my sense, but just to ask for clarification, since a lot of academic speak sometimes is like,
yes. It's annoying.
Yeah, well, I don't want to say annoying, but it just, and I want to make sure that it's engaging for the audience. So thank you, and let's get started with defining culture. I'll put this fancy little PowerPoint up here that really doesn't have anything to do with anything, because I feel sometimes each person defines culture a little bit differently. So if someone would like to start off by defining culture, how they feel is culture. Anyone? Anybody you guys wanna ask or answer that?
I maybe will field this one because I have been tasked with teaching Korean culture for like the last several years, and I often it's not easy because a lot of people want to say that culture is very fixed and it's like it exists and there's no disputing it and it is not up for debate. But what I try to emphasize in the ways that I talk about it is that culture is kind of a matter of consensus, and it is fluid and it does change. So the images that we have here are food. I guess
it's
that's
supposed to
maybe
be like
hanbok.
yeah,
Yeah.
And of course music. That's most generation.
Yeah. So right. So kind of depending on who you're talking to, culture will include customs, language, tradition. It can encompass, architecture, clothing, like these kinds of tangible things. But the meaning that is attributed to those material things is kind of what's up for debate and what gets determined by consensus. Also, like if language is part of culture, which I argue it totally is, that's something that exceeds individual opinion, or like you use a language, you're born into a place, and you don't get to decide how language works exactly. But if you can get enough people to kind of use a word in a different way, then you can make some changes to your cultural space. So it's not a hard and fixed thing. It really is malleable, but it can only change with consensus. It's not like one person who gets to decide that I can define culture this way, if that makes sense.
I think that's a great definition. I think for me, I think of culture in the way that maybe Stuart Hall, who's a British diasporic scholar, and I think just basically just everyday lived experiences. I think when I was growing up, it's like culture is classical music and the opera, and it's not. Culture is about folks like us, right? Everyday people living in what are the kind of values, shared values that shape our experiences, and we're living through every day, especially in kind of in a highly globalized state. We're experiencing so many different kinds of cultures at once and cultural values at once, and so. It's what's shared, it's what's collectively shaped and defined. I think that there are powers that try to shape what culture is or tell us what culture is, but in the end, we as people, everyday folks, have the power to define that in our own terms.
Yeah, big C and little c.
Yeah.
That's how it.
Okay, so before I get to this next slide, I just want to put out, I guess, like a trigger warning. We're going to talk about some things that are very sensitive topics. Some people might get uncomfortable. Shoot, I got uncomfortable with some of these things when I was looking over the slides and trying to put together something where it's not very ooh, which it's going to get very ooh here, okay? But safe place, and if you have a question, ask. We're here to learn. I'm here to learn. The panelists are going to teach, and if there's any questions, yes, learn too, of course. Please just feel free, okay? All right, here we go with cultural appropriation. Just out of curiosity, yeah. Is it okay if I ask the audience a few things?
Please.
Okay, so out of curiosity, we look at this photo. Everybody is familiar with this, yes? Okay, I put a little note there. This is Kai of XO from, I believe, Coco Pop era. How does it make you feel?
I was so disappointed when I saw it.
You were disappointed, okay. Anyone else have similar feelings or something very different?
I was indifferent.
You were indifferent, okay. Yeah, when I saw this, I did raise an eyebrow, and then like 2 seconds it's like, okay, whatever, because we've had history, which we'll talk about. So, I hate to keep asking you guys for definitions, but how do you feel about cultural appropriation? Miranda, what do you define this as?
Me.
It can be layman's terms, you can go deep, whatever you prefer.
I always go deep. So for this image, which I still have a reaction to. So we mentioned in the other day in the Black American Music and K-pop panel that there's cultural appropriation and there's also cultural misappropriation, and that one way we might want to think about this is it's always contextual and it's always very sticky. It has to do with, in the situation, who has power, what symbols have power to what people, and also then how the image, in this case, how it travels, right? How it's received in different places. So for example, I would tell you that when this happened and I was living in Tokyo, this was completely seen as fashion. Because for most of the Japanese people around me, that is exactly what this is. Oh, it's just fashion, it's a concept, it's something that he's doing for promotion, which I would say, and I think we forgot to mention this the other day, is the idea of agency. So everyone got really mad, I think, when this happened, and I did too, but that was not Kai's decision, right? So this means that there are more people involved who thought this was a good idea. which is the whole other issue. So we have to think about agency for the idols when we get angry. Now, very different when we think about Jackson, right?
Yeah.
Same thing happening with Jackson Wang. Jackson Wang gets a backlash, and then he goes on SNS and says, yo, stop being haters, whatever. Then we can get mad at Jackson. So for cultural appropriation and cultural misappropriation, if you have any of that problematic, is the word, the problematic feeling when you see an image like this, then you have to wonder who's in power, right? Why does this make me uncomfortable? And if this was someone who looked different or sounded different or had a different statement when they took on this image, how would it make you feel?
So in this case, I kind of like the words on the screen. I mean, I think that's a really helpful place to start.
Thank you.
I think in the panel that Miranda was just talking about, the Black American music and K-pop panel, Dr. Crystal Anderson also was talking about maybe the ways that cultural appropriation and misappropriation are sort of blended together so that, you know, maybe it's more useful for us to maintain a kind of distinction. But I wanted to kind of draw attention to the fact that like appropriation within that word is some notion of property. And so taking something and making it into your own property that maybe wasn't yours to begin with. But I do think we also get into a tricky territory when we think of culture as property, because ownership, again, we were just talking about how culture is collective, right? So it's again, really tricky and can kind of lead us into impasses when we think about it as some sort of like, it's mine. Only I can have it. But then at the same time, we have to be respectful when it's clearly not yours, right? And when your identity is not premised on that kind of culture and tradition. And so, again, it's sticky, and maybe appropriation or misappropriation as words force us to think about property, and that can be part of the problem.
Yeah, I am thinking about all those things and just want to build on that. Two things. I think it's sticky and tricky because oftentimes when we look towards Asia and we think about culture, we tend to have very static ideas about what Asian culture is. It's hanbok, it's traditional things, right? It's, I think, sometimes difficult for us in the West. I hate saying stuff like that. But, you know, in the US, those of us who have grown up in American culture, right? It's easy to look at Asia or Korea specifically and be like, Korean culture is all of these ancient traditions. So then what is Korean culture today, right? And so I think it's really useful what Patty said, right? That it's an everyday lived experience. That said though, right, I think what Michelle's saying is that when we think of it as property and ownership and who can do what, it becomes really confusing. So scholar Minha Pham has this term called racial plagiarism, right? And she's trying to point out that often when we get into these debates about appropriation, misappropriation, we sometimes land on feelings, right? Like I meant to or I didn't mean to, or I really love the culture and so I did it because I love it. And so these debates, particularly on the internet, right? You'll see people fighting over these things around intent. And so she brings up this term racial plagiarism to say, well, maybe there's more specific ways we can think about it. And plagiarism is a great term because we all know what that is, right? You use someone's writing, for example, that's not your own, but you pretend like it is. And you don't give credit where credit is due. And then often, right, you can get something, a benefit from that, right? So you can sort of track something that maybe didn't originate from you or your community. Are you giving proper credit where credit is due? And are you benefiting, aka making money? And the people who originated that are not seeing any of that benefit. Again, I don't think that makes it that much clear. We're still in sort of murky waters, but it's one way I think of sort of thinking through, of the whole appropriation, misappropriation thing with maybe some more clearer lines.
Right. I think that what I've noticed as a casual K-pop fan, there's been a big argument of appropriation versus appreciation, where a lot of people are like, no, he's appreciating what this, he loves your music, so, or he loves your style, so this is why he's doing this. And it's like, well, actually, this is not appreciating, this is appropriating, and here's why. Like when you brought up Jackson, I understand, maybe he really was trying to appreciate. I didn't have a problem with this. As I said in the Black American Music panel, I don't really have issues with hairstyles. My issue with Jackson was when he responded, like, y'all need to get over yourself. It's like, no, we're trying to educate, which is fine because not everybody knows everything. And what you should have done was just like, okay, I've been educated, whether you take it down or not, but at least now you know, instead of, you know, getting your defenses up and like, y'all just need to get over. It's like, we can't just get over, you know. And I'm sure that there's other situations that have happened like this. Okay, here's some more jarring pictures coming. Let's be prepared. Okay, and the reason, all right, I'll let it sink in. Let it sink in. The reason why I put these up here is because a lot of times when I hear, okay, you know, culture vulture, cultural appreciation, it's usually with Black music or Black style, Black hair. But we also have, as you can see, these. And I don't hear as much, not saying that it doesn't happen, people don't get up in arms, but I honestly don't hear as loud a roar when they take from other cultures. And I just wanted some of the members to chime in. Have you ever heard of, like, here, my friend, with the beanie on her head? I think she did get some flack for that, actually, from Oh My Girl. Yeah. I don't know if you guys know about Oh My Girl. They basically just made a whole comeback based off of them doing this. And this was after the fact that people called them out, like, look, please don't take our culture and use it for your music group or for your music video. And they did that and more. So I just find it interesting.
What is she wearing?
A bindi.
A bindi. So there was that, and then there was, you see how her hands are?
Yeah, I was distracted by the hat.
Yeah.
The
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then the Native American headdress, that's also not something. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of pictures out there, music videos, and I'm sure we could be up here for the rest of our lives. So,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we'll just move on, okay? Because it's awesome.
Lock the doors.
All right. So let's get into hip hop because I think this is. Do you want to talk about it? It's fine.
That one kind of like, I remember that whole.
It's because we went to the last year's panel and the
This
year
was the
before
topic.
about that one. So.
And it's still, I mean, she's not the only one that does this, but
Yeah, there was a lot of like.
Forgive my ignorance, but who is that?
oh, I'm sorry. So CL, she was part of YG, and this is one of her MVs. As you can see, they're all dressed up in particular outfits that they perceive as cool, I'm sure, and it makes them look hard, they think. But
I mean, it makes them look cool, and I think it's also like what is globally tracking in a particular moment. And you know, these labels, you know that they're watching global trends, and they're trying to compete with major, you know, big three European, American labels that are dominate 70% of the market, music market, right? So it's about looking cool. It's about obviously like putting off a particular era, but it's also trying to find what is popular, and then quickly reproducing that for a Korean audience and an Asian audience. So. Yeah.
Interesting. It's bound to happen because Black culture is always trending.
I mean,
Right.
Like,
it's now what like the most popular genre, or rap and R&B have become the most popular genre in the world again. So there was a moment where there was a lag, but now it's back.
so my question is, where does it lie? Like we said earlier, do we get mad at the artists themselves, or do we get mad at the company because, you know, the we got the big three, they're out there trying to make their money.
I feel it's both. It should be both. Like, yeah, as an artist, you're performing it, so you have a responsibility to say no. But as a label, you should be like conscious of what you're doing, and not just throw anything out there to make money.
So I think a couple years ago I mentioned this, that a lot of the idols I tend to work with in Tokyo are rookies to the point of they've been sort of shoved out or pushed out of the rookie scene in Korea. So they go to Japan and that's where they want to start building their career. And not only talking to them, but talking to stylists. So there's a couple of stylists that I have in contact with for my research and asking them, why did you choose this outfit, or why are you styling his hair that way? What is the concept today, type of thing. And in a lot of cases, an artist cannot say no. There's not a space for them to say no. Unfortunately, we now live in, at this point, CL could say no.
Right.
She made it to the point where she could. And so I think when we ask, who should we get mad at, this will be maybe the academic concept from it, is to get mad at the structure itself. Right. Because what the structure is asking you to do is K-pop's a product, we're consuming this product, and the product has certain styles to it. This is no different, right? We've seen white people do this, we've seen other people of color do this, and we've had different feelings about whether or not it's considered appropriate, or whether it's something that we want to consume and use as our own popular culture. I think we have to get mad at the structure, and the advice that I gave 2 years ago was to support rookie idols who are outside the system, because they can say no when they're not forced into the contracts that we might get with the big three. They do have the space where if you say, actually that hairstyle, actually wearing your shirt that way, it has this meaning, they can listen. So that's always my advice to people, is to try and support some idols that actually do have some agency.
So I could be very wrong, so please correct me, but is it not the case that this image comes from a video that CL made that was targeting the US market?
No, I think this was before the.
This was before?
Yeah.
Okay, because.
Wait, this is not the which one is this?
No.
Oh, it's not.
That's right.
I think so.
You could say
But no, it wasn't. Yeah, like what? So when you say targeting the American market, I'm thinking of her like her English songs.
Yeah.
I don't think this was before.
This is before that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was before. Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
That's helpful actually, because I wanted to kind of raise the consideration that in some ways, this gesture, knowing that CL is a K-pop artist who really aims to diversify outside and target a Western audience, I wonder if that changes also our assessment of what's going on, because it's quite a different situation when K-pop artists are like wearing the bindi or taking cultural signifiers and really decontextualizing them and using them as decoration, and assuming that their audience is not going to know any better, and so then they won't have to face any consequences for it, right? Here it's like the gesture reads maybe more ambiguously if the idea is, she's trying to say that she wants to be a part of this culture and get acknowledgement from people who are a part of it as well.
I do understand what you're saying. I feel personally, since it is CL, who did go to an international school, who has been over here quite some time, she knows better. So if this was, it wasn't, but just to say if it was geared towards her American artist, she really missed the mark on it. I didn't need to cut off.
It was the best market. I think by this, what year was this? Did this come out? 2013?
2013.
By 2011, YG knew that the U.S. from YouTube metrics that the U.S. was its biggest outside market outside of Korea, or not the biggest. Sorry, they were tracking the most of the U.S. And at that point, CL at least was in conversation with what's his name from
Scooter, right?
Black Eyed Peas.
Oh, Will.i.am.
Yeah. So there was, if not, maybe they weren't actually actively pursuing the market, but there was definitely an eye towards
Yeah.
it, so,
Yeah.
not to say that that was obviously a very terrible marketing strategy, but I think that there was a way that they were pivoting here. And it's also like just part of, I mean, YG's concept,
Yes.
you know, as a
Yes.
group, they feel like they get themselves in the most trouble.
Yes,
you
I'm
know?
glad you brought that up
Yeah,
because
it
here
looks
we
like she
go
just rated
with
Jujutsu.
Big Bang. Back when they debuted, this is how they were, and this was what 08, 09 era, I believe. And for those who don't know about the woman down there, that's Trudy, who is a rapper. When she was on I'm Pretty Rap Star, when I first noticed her, that is what she looked like. But if you can see in the other picture, that is not what she really looks like.
I see no difference.
Oh, yeah, same thing, same girl. I had to verify because I was like, there's no way, but it really is. So the thing with Trudy was that she was emulating earlier rapper named Yoon Mire, who is a Black Korean woman, very popular, I think, at the time, singer, rapper, and so Trudy came out and tried to emulate maybe a little bit too much with that, and you know, I believe she did receive a lot of backlash internationally. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. No, okay, no. Let's just say she. Yes. Sorry.
I had a question. So I see online a lot of blowback coming from African American fans. Now, just looking at those pictures, for me, some of it looked like Southern California Latinx culture.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
So
in
do
that
we,
video.
so do we
Yeah.
not get a lot? I've never seen a lot of stuff coming from fans from those cultures. Is there a lot of blowback?
That
Coming from
perhaps
those communities?
I don't know.
But there is a really big Latinx fan base.
Yeah,
There's a
there
really
is.
big Latinx fan base, and also what's
Japan
interesting
is
is if you look at a lot of the K-pop groups now when they market in Japan, that fashion is now fashionable in Japan. So you'll have K-pop, Cholo, yeah.
Oh, wow.
They have this.
So you'll have K-pop groups who are marketing to Japanese, and then they're dressing in Cholo style, and there's a lowrider in the video, and they're wondering why are these symbols possibly making someone like me upset. So that's a place where you will see it, and you will see some fan reaction online. I just don't think it's gotten as much traction, but it's definitely there.
There's also like a decent sized like lowrider community in Japan too.
Yeah.
And like Latin community kind of. There's like a rapper or something like that that they do have that style. I forgot who they were, but yeah.
A Korean rapper?
No, it's a Japanese.
Yeah, Japanese
Oh,
rappers
Japanese.
have
Oh,
this.
okay.
That West Coast Latin culture is actually kind of big in Japan.
Really?
Huge.
Yeah.
It's like it's also a class thing too. It's like high and rich people. Rich kids.
I'm not too sure about that. It is expensive.
Oh, right.
I mean, one thing I think that it's important to mention, you know, Miranda mentioned the structure, right? And, you know, that white people have been doing this, and I think that if we can sort of think about that point a little longer, right? This is not just a phenomenon that's happening between Korea and Black communities, right? The U.S. is in that mix, and how is the U.S. in that mix? You know, the U.S. has occupied South Korea, right?
Yes.
Since
And Japan, so Japan
Right.
and Korea are both part of.
Exactly,
US
and,
Empire.
and if we just think about music, just music, right? If at the end of the Korean War, really, the only spaces and places where musicians could get jobs at that time were military bases. And what did they have to play? They had to play American music, Black music. And so this sort of sounds of Korean popular music come from that relationship. And it's not a neutral relationship, right? It's a very uneven relationship. Where certainly Koreans become inculcated in the racial dynamics of the US, which is all, I think, undergirding what we're talking about, right? That there is some anti-Blackness. I think actually from the slide, I can see that that's where we're going next. But just to say, right, this is not happening just in a vacuum in the contemporary moment. There's this deep historical imperial context that we have to acknowledge where Black culture becomes a part of the imperial relationship between the US and Korea, right? So, you know, certainly Black people are not, right, the kind of hegemonic power, in the U.S., but Black culture becomes a tool, right? Part of the uneven relationship between Korea and the U.S. And I think that we have to acknowledge that is part of what's shaping these images and the way they then get selected, right? For consumption, for commodification, and globalization. And so even though white people are not in this, right, sort of like in vividly, we have to acknowledge that history. Exactly, white supremacy.
I wanted to just mention like a kind of fact that isn't widely, I don't know if it's widely known, at least from talking to my students, they are not aware of this, but the Korean War was actually the first in like military engagement that the U.S. participated in with desegregated troops. So they mixed Black and white service people in this particular conflict. But the kind of racial hierarchies were maintained in other ways, and often it was through how the local population interacted with them. So it makes sense that in some ways anti-Blackness was transmitted actually through this contact. And so, it's a really important history to be aware of. You might not think that kind of military history is that related to, the K-pop scene, but it is integral to understand, that history. So it's important to be curious about that.
So we talked about cultural appropriation versus misappropriation, cultural appreciation. How do we explain this? When in 2019, we still have blackface going on. These are pictures from GAG concert, both of them. These are just a few dates because it has happened after these dates where they wear blackface, basically. I mean, there's real, to me, there's no excuse at this point. Even with Mamamoo, got in trouble fairly recently, doing brownface, thinking they're like, we just put on darker makeup, and they're like, we're just paying homage to Bruno Mars. How do we begin to even unpack this? Because at this day and age, that happened after all of these, and each event, of course, received major backlash. But people still feel that it is okay to do blackface in the variety show in the comedic sense. So, what are your thoughts on it? I have all. Okay. Let's a little bit.
I mean, I think that there are two things to consider. The television industry is generally thinking about a domestic audience, even though it also has to think about how the popularity of Korean culture around the world means that they're going to be hearing complaints and hearing some pushback from international fans. But the assumption is still that the domestic population is not so aware of these things and not sensitive about it, and that they are not going to have any problem with it, and in fact will find humor in it. So that's one thing, and I think that's why you still see these kinds of things, even though people should know better. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that these kind of the iconography of these representations, it's really familiar from Europe and the U.S., right? Yeah. So it's being learned somehow.
True,
right?
That was decades ago.
Right.
So
oh, absolutely.
This is this century.
Yes. So I live and work in Canada right now, even though I'm a U.S. citizen. I was born and raised in the States. And it's interesting because what I often hear, because I used to live in Quebec, and there have been many, many, many blackface incidents, and a lot of really recent stuff. There was this musical that featured slave songs that was mounted by the most famous playwright in Quebec, and it involved there was, I think, 1 or 2 members of the chorus who were Black. So And the alibi that was given is, oh, well, it has a totally different connotation. Blackface doesn't mean the same thing when it's not the US.
All right, audience, how do you feel
And
about
so
that?
that is often the argument that's made over and over. Like, we'll use US exceptionalism in this particular way to shove off accountability and blame.
I think what's really fascinating about this is, again, structure. So on the same channels you will see this, you will also see a phenomenon I'm sure many of you have seen, lots of adorable half Korean children on TV shows where they say, look, they're half, look, and it's a multiracial person. Anytime you start throwing the word half at me, I get very uncomfortable. But this is common in my lived experience in East Asia, that the definition is simply half. So this will be on these images, and then you'll be seeing these children that are supposed to be celebrated for multiculturalism. And there's actually a push from the Korean government of, this is great, we're becoming multicultural South Korea. We have kids who are bilingual and trilingual, but it's up against this imagery. And I don't know how we can excuse this for any kind of representation as being appropriate. That's not just me speaking as a Black person, that's just any type of basically making ridiculous parody that's completely incorrect, and as you pointed out, centuries and centuries ago, even if we're talking about North America. So if you're going through YouTube feed and you're going through and seeing that there's this happening, and then there's a show where they're celebrating multiculturalism, that's when you're supposed to question, why does the structure think that this is okay? Great, that's my call to arms. Please do that.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think they kind of captured it. I think just thinking about how so much of like nationalism in South Korea has been wrapped up in this idea or myth of racial purity, ethnic purity, that's been kind of shored up over decades of military dictatorships, mostly like US supported. And so I think that there's a way that there's a very rigid idea of what counts as what's included in the nation. And I think that there's a governmental push in the way that diversity is kind of used. Multicultural is sort of becoming this term too, but I think it's also kind of attending to a huge sort of labor force that's coming into South Korea.
Keep talking, I'm just
from
changing the
Nepal, how refugees coming to getting involved with the kind of refugee situation in Jeju. You get a lot of Yemenis that were landing in Jeju. And I think the government's trying to find a way to deal with that in a way that's sort of globally facing, but the reality of what's inside is obviously very different. And also just in terms of through the research that I've studied or kind of gathered in the documentary I've made, one thing I did notice is that I've been looking at a lot of the images of American military entertainers that came through the bases in South Korea during the war, and Jolson performed in South Korea before he died right after he came back from one tour, entertainment tour. He performed there like 50 times, some insane number of times, and I was looking at images of his performance, and he opened his base like a blackface sort of troop or entertainment space within the military camp. And so that so far is where I kind of first tracked the origins of blackface in South Korea, was through the military bases. And do you know all know who Jolson is? He's
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
No.
I'm asking them. I just don't want to make it.
Do it. It's like cinema studies, fun fan time. Right? We get to teach them the first sound film ever, right?
Yeah.
Warner, October 7th.
Go UCLA.
1927. First sound film, Warner Brothers. So Al Jolson's a jazz singer, and he was a white Jewish man performing in blackface.
He repopularized blackface.
And repopularized blackface, and then this sort of became the face of American popular culture abroad, like you were saying, and making spaces where American imperialism pushed into other countries.
Wasn't it? I thought I heard he was trying to do it as in a positive way, and like
Appreciation.
there
we go.
something like that. Like he was like, because he had like a bunch of jazz singer friends or something like that, and he was like trying to get them out there or something.
I think they-
I was like, this is wild.
He performed in
So-
he performed in blackface for years before
Yeah.
the film, as did others.
So I almost feel like we can think about blackface in Korea as it's an American import, but also I think it's in a way like historically has been tied to what it means to be an American, right? And anti-black racism is, like one of the U.S.'s global exports. So.
You can argue that blackface has been around before blackface was around, because like you have like traditions of I think it's I think the Netherlands or something like that, where it's the Christmas thing
Christmas
like,
thing,
people
yeah.
just put,
That's
like,
to the day. So
yeah.
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, I saw
Yeah,
that
it
fairly
looks like
recently. Yeah.
I wanted to raise, one point that we could maybe add to this conversation, see what you
Got 10
think.
minutes, absolutely.
Because it seems to me that as K-pop and Korean culture and all these like kind of adjacent objects and fields and things become associated with the Korean way, the globalization of Korean culture, that in a weird way, all of these things are becoming detached from some essential idea of like who gets to embody and who gets to perform culture. Because, like the tourism board is really interested in giving lots and lots of people the idea that they can come to Korea and put on the hanbok and eat.
You could do it downstairs.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can
right.
make kimchi at home and do all these things that are supposed to be like these really core essential signs of Koreanness. And so if this is what's kind of happening, that there's like more, that this idea of culture as performance that can be taken up by anyone as long as they're, they're appreciating it. How do we kind of make sense of that? Like that Korean culture industries themselves are telling people that culture is a performance. It's not essential that you be from here or you be, because there is this kind of paradox to the fact that the idea of like Koreanness is really bloodbound, is hereditary, like, the purity of the homogeneity of the population coexists with this other idea of the idea that Korean culture can spread everywhere and be everywhere and become the most successful export.
We're basically all here
Yeah.
because of it. I don't think KCON would exist, if it wasn't for that. But I do have a question about that because that brings up we'll go with the fetishism. You'll hear people, I walked around the convention and, I'll hear it's like, oh, Oppa is so handsome. And it's like, when I was first getting into it, I'll admit I was learning the language, but a certain type of language. It's like fan language, And then now it's like, I feel cringy when I hear that. And it's like where it seems some people are starting to fetishize, the culture. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes.
Double yes.
Moving along.
Double yes.
All right.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, what I often hear also is like, Asian men have been Asian masculinity has been so undesirable in the US for so long, and look at how K-pop is making Asian men finally sexy, and I'm like, it's such a complicated.
Heijin, right?
He's so handsome. He wasn't.
He was too.
Sorry, I just like participated in that. Sorry. But it's interesting that is like desirability is this sort of like this ultimate goal, and of course it's part of it. I mean, it's a part of it's not wrong to want that, but it's interesting that is sort of like this go-to thing. Look how great K-pop is. It's like making Asian men,
Sexy.
Yeah.
Handsome.
Yeah.
And they are.
That's not really like a helpful comment, but
That's
it's
not
just
wrong. It's just, let's see, what time is it?
Should probably go with questions.
Yes, questions, please, yes.
I was gonna comment on that. I have a Korean friend who started getting a bunch of likes on Tinder after BTS popped off.
It was that quick?
Yeah, and
Wow.
he actually found himself in a place where he was trying to figure out like who he was as an individual, because he was like, should I feed in to this fetish and like dress like a K-pop star, or like should I change my back?
It's like purple hair. Pirate tie.
It's still an issue, like just because they're looking at them in a certain type of way. They want them to wear the makeup or have a slim build or be super muscular, and it's like that's not the only time that an Asian male is attracted.
Right.
I mean, ultimately, it's not very humanizing, right?
Right.
And then what do you do for folks like, I don't know, moi, who falls outside of whatever scripts of what is considered to be sexy, or like, what is the kind of ideal Korean person or body, Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to
enough.
Oh,
All
yeah.
right. Obviously.
I just want to say, like, this is nothing new. I see a lot of articles that are really interesting saying, especially in higher education, of they don't know how to deal with this demand of students who suddenly want to learn the Korean language, or are interested in popular culture. And then I was sitting over there in Tokyo going, well, I'm in Tokyo because I was one of those people 10 years ago who was really into anime and was really into Japanese things, and that's how I got to Japan. But going with that comes a responsibility to learn about, again, the structure. So for me, I learned Japanese, but I also learned Japanese history. And then when I moved there, I had my everyday experiences, my culture experiences that made me realize there are things that I have to deal with. This isn't a perfect place. This isn't, what I idealized in my head if I did do that. And I think we have to do that also even in spaces like KCON, where everything is bright and shiny and pretty cool and awesome, but we also have to come to these spaces and have difficult conversations with each other. Because we can take this back when we go on the internet, right? Or when we're at home, when we're watching these things, or talking with our friends, and then we can have those difficult conversations at home.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because the final question, since I believe we're almost out of time, to the panel members would be, what can we do to break down this cultural appropriation? Like, how can we change it? Well, yes, despite the power, but aside from that, or in addition to that. Any ideas that maybe somebody like in the audience or like myself can take home, and the next time we see one of our K-pop friends, or just someone in general doing something, it's like, hey, that ain't cool, and here's why. Maybe we don't necessarily have the language to use, so if perhaps you can suggest something for us to do, I think that would be really a good thing.
Like she has a burning suggestion.
Oh, okay, yes, all right.
I'm not sure about the details, but I think that somehow focusing more on appreciation of the culture would help to, I guess, decrease the amount of fetishization of the culture. So like, I feel like maybe making him up and learning the Korean language are good examples of appreciating Korean culture. Whereas the dating profiles, like you all mentioned, are fetishization. So if we learn how to differentiate between the two, then we can focus on one more than the other.
Thank you. Yep. Yes, sir.
I think in order to tackle this situation, it's very important to educate yourself and understanding the community's reaction and why we're very defensive or we're very unhappy with what these people are doing. So, like, if someone does end up doing their hair in a certain fashion that's very inappropriate, I think that individual should take the responsibility in understanding why the outside is reacting to it and how, and I'm sure that all of us, there will be instances where we will make mistakes in appropriating things, like minor things. So it's also important for us to understand, oh, okay, I understand why people would be angry about this, and I should learn there are multiple subtle instances and reasons why this is happening.
We always have these awesome debates every time whenever we come to KCON, and one of the things that we discussed about earlier was that the newer generation of K-pop fans, they're not taking the time. When I got into K-pop, I got into K-pop from anime to Japanese drama to Korean drama to now K-pop. So I have been in the fandom for quite a while. So when I first started out with K-pop, I kind of wanted to learn the language, still do, but it's right now I'm learning the alphabet, the grammar, the pronunciation, and it is hard. But I want to take the time to kind of educate myself with that. But what I was discussing with him about him earlier was that the newer generation, they're sort of have this veil over their eyes of this shiny little beautiful ball, but they're not actually noticing the negative. Like, for example, when they see a K-pop fan, they'll automatically assume it's a Korean boob. And like, or like one of the videos that I saw, or a post where one of, I think it was a white guy that was taking plastic surgery to become Jimin. And that hurt me. I was just like, what? Like, is this really happening? And I mean, like, plastic surgery is like, it's one of the taboo things that I'm still not comfortable with. But when I heard that, I was just like, no. I was just like so out of it. But that's one of the things where I have a lot of issues with the newer generation, which is why tomorrow it's like we're going to the panel for how to deal with K-pop with the newer generation. When you have like old fans and the new fans, they're still kind of newbies. They haven't desensitized themselves. They haven't educated themselves over the stuff. And then you have older fans trying to kind of like give them a guiding hand, but they don't want it. So it's like, it's really hard to kind of
hold a panel for
find a balance of that.
I mean, I guess I would add, like, kind of going off of your comment that,
Whoops. Nope.
It's really helpful when fans within fan culture kind of make it clear that you can voice criticism of your idols and of fellow fans without destroying them or without saying you're canceled or without, I mean, you have to be able to take your, so there's this kind of idea that if you criticize the thing you love, then you don't love it anymore, but actually you love it more. You can love it more.
It's like, it's harder with the newer fans because they take everything
so little.
Yeah, right. So then if like they can become maybe more acculturated, and when they become, fans that have been in the fandom longer, they'll look back on that reaction and think, oh, okay, I've learned some things.
Okay, all right. We're actually out of time. I'm so sorry. Do you want to Korean War for the last? Okay, Korean War. 20 seconds. 20 seconds, you guys. Go ahead. Go. Yeah. Very brief.
I was just going to point out that it's interesting to me that the first half of this was about the dehumanization of Black people, and then we sort of ended on the dehumanization of Asians or Koreans, right? That like, in both those instances, the problem is that we have a hard time seeing these groups, POCs, as human, but we never have this conversation the other way, right? Like, appropriation of white culture, or like the dehumanization of white people, right? And in quite the same way, right? And it's because there's a sort of global structure that's in place, and so maybe this is like the professorial comment, but that I think is what we need to examine and study and
like
think
whitewashing.
about.
Like with a lot of the Asian culture, like even African American models, they when they get their photos taken, they automatically add like more lighter tones on them.
Yeah.
They don't allow the darker tones.
We did talk about it a bit at the blackness panel, and I brought up, let's talk about whiteness.
Right. So it's like.
But so the last thing that I want to say is, so we've all just sat here, we've gone through all of these topics, and we've all talked about this in English. Mm-hmm. So the only thing that so we've talked about, well, what about learning Korean? About this. One thing I will ask you as a fan who lives in Japan and who often sees idols doing broadcasts and things on Instagram or VLive, please stop asking them to speak in English.
Yes.
Because that is one of the #1 things that I think is breaking apart the great thing about K-pop, which is bringing people together from everywhere. And English has such a gigantically political meaning in other countries. So if you're asking yourself, well, should I learn Korean? Should I do this? You can do one tiny thing and just don't ask them, hi, please say hi in English. Just don't do it.
Thank you so much for joining us.